everyone, and welcome. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on a huge area of law that, honestly, affects all of us. We're talking about tort law. Now, I know it sounds a little intimidating, but it's really all about how the legal system handles the everyday wrongs that happen between people. So, let's dive right in. Okay, just picture this for a second. It's a totally normal day. You're out shopping, minding your own business, and bam, you slip on a wet floor that had no warning sign. Your arm is broken. What happens next? Who's responsible? Do you just have to deal with it? Well, this is exactly the kind of situation that tort law was built to answer. The word tort itself is pretty cool, actually. It comes from the Latin word tortuum, which means to twist. And I think that's the perfect way to think about it. A tort is a twisted act, right? It's a civil wrong that twists away from the normal, acceptable way we're all supposed to act in society. It's a breach of a duty that the law puts on all of us, and it ends up causing real harm to someone else. So here's our game plan for today. We're going to start with the basics of what a tort actually is, then we'll see how it's different from a crime or a contract issue. We'll also get into who's responsible, what some of the defenses are, and finally, we'll talk about the whole point of tort law in the first place. All right, first things first, let's get our bearings and figure out where tort law fits on the big legal map. You know, it's super easy to get it confused with criminal law or contract law, but trust me, it's very much its own unique thing. And this table here really breaks it down. See, a tort is a wrong against an individual. A crime, on the other hand, is seen as a wrong against society as a whole. And that's a huge difference. It's why tort law is all about compensating the victim, while criminal law is about punishing the offender. And a breach of contract? Well, that's different too, because that's about a specific duty you voluntarily agreed to in a contract, while the duties in tort law are just imposed on everybody, no agreement needed. Okay, now we're getting into the really fascinating stuff. A couple of legal puzzles that are at the heart of tort law. We're going to look at two old-school Latin phrases that really help us understand what actually counts as a wrong in the eyes of the law. So our first piece of ancient legal wisdom is this: damnum sine injuria. So what does that mean? It literally translates to damage without a legal injury. And here's the absolute key. You can suffer a very, very real loss. We're talking money, emotional distress, whatever. But if none of your actual legal rights were violated, the law says, sorry, you don't have a tort case. Let me give you a classic example. Let's say you own a great little coffee shop. Then a huge new coffee chain opens right next door. And your profits totally tank. Now, you have absolutely suffered damage, right? But because that new shop was just playing the game of fair competition, they didn't violate any of your legal rights. That, right there, is damnum sine injuria. Now, let's flip that idea completely on its head, which honestly is even more interesting. It's called injuria sine damnum. This one means a legal injury without any actual damage. So in this situation, one of your legal rights was violated, even if you can't point to any specific loss you suffered because of it. And in tort law, that's enough. The violation of the right itself is considered the harm. The textbook case for this is a really old one called Ashby versus White. A man was illegally stopped from casting his vote in an election. Now, it turns out the candidate he was going to vote for won anyway, so you could argue, hey, no harm, no foul. But the court said, nope, doesn't matter. His fundamental legal right to vote was violated, and that alone, that was enough for him to sue. So we've got a handle on what a tort is. But when something goes wrong, a big question is, who actually pays for it? Because it's not always the person who directly caused the problem. And this brings us to a super important idea called vicarious liability. Vicarious liability is basically a rule that says one person can be held legally responsible for the wrongs of someone else. Let's go right back to that slip and fall in the store. An employee was careless and forgot the wet floor sign. Now, you could probably sue that employee, sure, but way more importantly, you can sue their employer, the store itself. That is vicarious liability in a nutshell. But why? Why does this rule even exist? Well, there are a few big reasons. First, the employer is the one who controls and directs what the employee does. Second, the employer benefits from all that work. They're making a profit from it. And third, and this is the really practical part, it's about something lawyers call deep pockets. The employer, the company, is just in a much better financial position to actually pay for the victim's injuries and make things right. Okay, so just because someone got hurt, it doesn't automatically mean the person who caused it is liable. The law is smart enough to know that sometimes an act that might look like a tort on the surface could actually be perfectly justified. So let's ask the question straight up. Is the person being sued, the defendant, always on the hook just because an injury happened? And the answer is a big, clear no. And here's why. The law has a whole toolkit of defenses. For example, there's consent. A boxer can't sue his opponent for getting punched in a match, right? He consented to that risk. There's also necessity, like if you have to break into someone's empty cabin to survive a blizzard. Then you've got self-defense, where you use reasonable force to protect yourself. Sometimes it's an act of God, like a completely unforeseeable earthquake that causes an injury. And finally, there's statutory authority, which just means a law specifically allowed the action to happen. But what about those situations where it feels impossible to prove exactly who was careless? Well, the law has a really powerful tool for that, and it's our last Latin phrase of the day, res ipsa loquitur. It means, simply, the thing speaks for itself, and it's used when an accident is just so obviously the result of carelessness that you don't need a mountain of evidence to prove it. The classic go-to example is a surgeon leaving a scalpel inside a patient. I mean, come on. Things like that just don't happen unless someone was negligent. The event itself practically screams who's responsible. Wow, we have covered a lot of ground, from definitions and puzzles to who's responsible and what their defenses are. But now let's zoom all the way out and ask the biggest question of all. What is the whole point of this entire system? Why does tort law even matter? And really, this is the most important takeaway of all. Unlike criminal law, which is about punishment, the number one goal of tort law is to make the victim whole again. It's about providing a remedy, usually money, to try and restore the injured person as closely as possible to the position they were in before the wrong ever happened. At its heart, it's about fairness and restoration. So as we wrap this up, I want to leave you with one final thought to chew on. These legal ideas we've talked about, they've been built up over hundreds of years. But what happens now, in a world of self-driving cars and AI? If a driverless car causes an accident, or an AI program makes a bad call that hurts someone, who's at fault then? Is it the owner, the programmer, the manufacturer? The fundamental questions of tort law are still the same, but finding the answers in our crazy modern world, well, that's the next great legal challenge.